Hello there and welcome along to Planet Sport Football Africa, a passion for sport production where we look at African football, what's happening around the continent and what African players are doing overseas. I'm Steve Vickers in Harare, Zimbabwe, joined by Ida Waringa and by Stuart Weir. And on this week's show, we review the inaugural CAF African Schools Football Championship finals, with winners coming from Guinea and Tanzania. And we have the second part of our interview with Frank Simon, a French sports journalist who's regarded as a great authority in African football, talking about his travels and his concerns.
Very few clubs, maybe 1, 2, 3 clubs per country are rich enough to reach a certain level.
That's coming later, plus Stuart on the English Premier League title race and the Uefa Champions League. Lots to talk about on the show as always this week. And we start with the inaugural CAF African Schools Football Championship Continental Finals, which ended last weekend in Durban in South Africa. Now, the 4-day event had boys and girls tournaments. The boys' champions are CS Ben Sekou Silla from Guinea, and the girls' winners were Fountain Gate School of Tanzania. Tell us more, Ida.
Well, Steve, I want to focus on the winners here because in as much as it's a school championship, the schools are representing their countries. And in that way, to see Tanzania, beat Morocco in the girls or Guinea beat South Africa in the boys, this isn't something that we see too often. It's not something that we see every day in continental football. And I was particularly taken by Fountain Girls of Tanzania because their way of doing things simply stands out, and it sadly isn't something that's too common in that region. I mean, website with regular updates of talent development, a big emphasis on sports to complement academics, in a continent, frankly, that often focuses on the latter while foregoing the former. They have players in the under-20 national team, Steve. They have a separate entity known as Fountain Girls Sports with its own CEO. Look, this is impressive. And you can see in this way as well that it's not luck that won them this. It was preparation. So it's fantastic, Steve, to see Sub-Saharan Africa taking women's sports so seriously. And you see the young kids also getting that experience, where it does become familiar to represent your country, and it does become familiar to play at a top level at a young age. And hopefully, this can develop further through levels of age grade football in those specific countries. Because as we often say in Africa, talent really does get lost along the way. Steve, CAF reported fun numbers of up to 6,000. That was at the Sugar Ray Zulu Stadium in Durban. And if that indeed is the case, then that's quite a turnout, if you ask me, for a junior championship. The winner took home $300,000, runners-up $200,000, and bronze $150,000. Now, this is a lot of money, Steve, especially when broken down into local context. $300,000 might not seem like much when we talk about the bigger scale of football, but that's over 700 million Tanzanian shillings. So I do hope that CAF has developed checks and balances to make sure that this money will be used in the right ways. And Steve, this program ran on 2 other levels before it got to the continental stage. I mean, there was the national level that ran through to July last year. And after that, there were 6 zonal levels that ran till December. And even the zonal winners, Steve, each got 100,000 all the way to third in the zones that got 50,000 each. And, people often talk about the need for development of age grade football in the continent. And yes, while we can have more regional tournaments for the junior national teams, this is another way to look at it, a school's perspective, that can hopefully dig even deeper by actually benefiting institutions instead of what would be a select few members of, say, a national junior team. I mean, this is taking it right to the grassroots level, Steve. Schools are supposed to use this prize money for development of sports infrastructure, amongst other things. Look, all in all, I think it was a fantastic effort from CAF. I know this is still very early days, but it would be good to see some success stories, say a decade from now, a player who took part in these schools championships and going on to shine continentally and perhaps even internationally.
Yes, that would be great indeed. Thanks, Ida. Do stay with us. Next here on Planet Sport Football Africa, brought to you by Passion for Sport, to part 2 of our interview with Frank Simon, a French sports journalist who's regarded as a great authority in African football. Now, Frank worked for France Football magazine for many years, and he's been covering African football for more than 30 years now as a reporter and commentator, and he's travelled all over the continent. He's known for his in-depth research and statistics on the African game. I met up with Frank when we were together at the African Nations Championship, the CHAN, in Algeria earlier this year. He was on the French language commentary team. I was in the English language commentary team. Well, I asked Frank about some of his first trips in the early 1990s.
That's true. You mentioned the very first country I went to. South Africa. I went there in autumn 1992 when South Africa was back in FIFA and CAF. I had a good friend that we all know, Mark Gleeson, is a big name for African football. He's a legend for all of us, for all the sports writers. And so Mark told me, Frank, just come to South Africa, come to Josie's, and then we'll be together and can help you. And it started like that. So South Africa, I went to Zimbabwe as well. When Reinhard Fabisch was the coach, I met with Bruce Robla and Peter Ndlovu, all these guys. I went to Eswatini, that time was Swaziland. And then it was West Africa, North Africa. I went to more than 36 countries in Africa now. I went to Sudan after that. I went to Angola. I went to Tanzania. East Africa, I've done a lot because my ex-wife comes from East Africa, so I was touring East Africa. Uganda as well. I'm married now to an Ivorian lady, so I do a lot on the other side, on the west side, and we have on the west coast the next AFCON coming to Côte d'Ivoire. So you can imagine I've been traveling, never as a tourist, always as a journalist, and I want to help also African football develop locally. If I can, I will help. Yeah.
Are there things that make you sad about African football when you talk about development and living in France, where European football is very advanced? Are there things that make you sad?
Very sad is the fact that you have soccer fields in Paris, in the suburbs, where you find plenty of players, guys who don't have papers, who cross the ocean or the Mediterranean Sea, and they are here. They want to find a club, so they train. They still have this hope, but it's so complicated. Maybe one of them will be lucky to get a contract somewhere, maybe in third division in another country, in second division in Cyprus or in Norway or whatever. It's really complicated. And also the fact that the dream is still alive for most of the African players to get a contract in Europe, and they take too much risk trying to cross the Mediterranean Sea, and it's a disaster. Most of the time what they'll meet is death with other people, and this is what makes me sad. You can still make a living if you believe in yourself. On the continent, you can move from let's say from Côte d'Ivoire and get a contract in Morocco or Algeria. You can live as a football player in another country, but in Africa, if you're good enough, if you're lucky, you can have this connection to Europe or to the Gulf states. But don't take a crazy risk of just crossing the sea. It's too dangerous. And yeah, this is what makes me sad. Also, what makes me sad that in Africa, the fact that the clubs, for me, I think they become more and more poorer. There is money in African football, but when you look at the situation, the way they are managed is not the proper way. Very few clubs, maybe 1, 2, 3 clubs per country are rich enough to reach a certain level. But for most of the clubs, when there's one chairman, one official, if he's not serious, then you know that within 6 months, the club will just collapse. The player won't be paid. and the situation would be complicated. I have this example with one of my best friend. He's a French coach. He's now in Cameroon with Canon Yaoundé. He has not been paid. The players have not been paid, and it's a big name. They have won the Champions League so many times, Canon Yaoundé. But now it's like an empty shell. There's nothing. Officials are not good. They are not good. They are not good officials. They don't know how to handle a club. And this is a very sad situation. African football needs good officials to develop also the grassroots football. Too much to do and too little time, too little money, let's say, given to the good person. So yeah, plenty of work to do.
Right. Let's talk about the Africa Cup of Nations. There have been amazing editions. Tell us about one or two of the most memorable AFCONs that you've been to.
1996 in South Africa, because that was the very first competition organized by South Africa. And it was fantastic for me to come back to South Africa, because I've been based in South Africa some years before. And to see how they developed and the passion. It was a fantastic edition. They did very well. Bafana won it, like few months after the rugby team won the World Cup in South Africa.
You've told us about famous players. Tell us about some of the coaches that you have got to know well over the years in African football, because there are many, many characters, amazing characters in African football coaching. Okay,
Claude Leroy, the French coach, was with Cameroon, with many countries. He finished his career as a coach of Togo. A very brilliant, very intelligent person. He won AFCON in 1988. He didn't win it after that, but still have a lot of prestige, and he used it, and he had many, many opportunities and contracts. He deeply loves Africa, but I know people now consider he's too old to handle a national team, but he's such an interesting person. He's a good man. So Claude Leroy, the German Gernot Rohr also for me is a good person. Former coach of Nigeria, Hervé Renard is such a lovely person. I knew him before he won the AFCON. He won twice with two different countries. With Saudi Arabia, if you remember well, he's the only one to have beaten Argentina at the World Cup in Qatar. Could tell you about the late Stefan Keshi, was such a wonderful man and great player. It's always nice when a great player turns into a good coach and a good motivator. Someone like Walid Regragui, who has taken Morocco to the 4th place of the last World Cup. He was a friend of mine. We were from the same generation. And when he was a player, we were very close. And a few months ago, he became the coach of Morocco. And I was lucky to be with the team when they prepared in Spain and then in Emirates. And I was so happy that he brought this team to that level. The first team ever in Africa to reach the semi-finals. He did it. He's a good coach. A few months before, he had won the Champions League with Wydad. And this is fantastic. And what is good now is that we have a new generation. I think in the coming years, we won't talk that much about the European coaches in Africa. We'll talk about the new generation of coaches who are born in Africa, and they do a good work in Africa, which is very positive, because they know the country, they know the culture, they know everything. They have played for the national team, so they deserve to be coaches for their countries.
I was talking there to Frank Simon, a French sports journalist who's travelled all around the continent covering African football, talking there about Hervé Renard, who he knows very well. And Renard's interesting journey continues from Saudi Arabia at the Men's World Cup. He's now taking France to the Women's World Cup finals, Ida.
Right, Steve, and on to a perfect start. Le Bleu just won their friendly in preparation of the Women's World Cup. Now, this is a man who clearly wants to experience as much as he can pack in. From Europe to Africa to the Middle East, all in the men's game, and now onto women's football, and at the grandest stage of all. But Steve, Africa is what really made him the coach he is today. Of that, there's no doubt. became the first coach to win the AFCON with 2 different countries, Zambia in 2012, the Ivory Coast in 2015. And then in 2017, he then oversaw Morocco's first World Cup qualification in 2 decades. And then they were able to build on that last year to give the performance of a lifetime. Of course, Renard was not the coach then, but still laid the basis. And his ability to adjust to whatever situation is seen again in his post-playing days. Steve, when he retired as a player, he's said to have worked as a cleaner trying to make ends meet and got so good at it that he even set up his own cleaning company. Talk about a jack of all trades.
Well, I must say I didn't know that about the great French coach Hervé Renard. Well, thanks a lot, Ida. This is Planet Sport Football Africa, brought to you by Passion for Sport. And still to come, Stuart on the English Premier League title race. Will those drop points for Arsenal prove costly? You can follow us on Twitter at Planet Sport FA, and you can download our app and listen to the show anytime and access past programs in our archive. To download the app, go to the Play Store or the Apple iTunes App Store and enter Planet Sport Football Africa. Let's go to social media now. Last week we asked, should clubs only be allowed to change the coach once a season? Now, with 12 managers fired already in the English Premier League this season, football analyst Tony Cascarino suggested that clubs should only be allowed to appoint a new manager once per season. This because Chelsea and Southampton have fired their manager twice this season, so they're on to their 3rd boss of the season. So we asked, what do you think? And we start in England, and Mark Reed says, I think they should only be changed out of season. That would make things more interesting. Ekene Ude Ozor in Nigeria says it's a good idea. It's becoming too ridiculous at Chelsea. John Harmon says there should be a minimum of 1 year before teams can sack their manager. But David Sakala in Zambia says such restrictions are not practical. You can't wait to be relegated to take action. Coaching is a performance-based job, says David. Chris in Rwanda says clubs have the right to sack who they want and whenever. And Jason Med in Malaysia says you can't blame the club if managers tried their luck on getting a big payday. So clubs can change managers as they please. Maklek Yaksat in Nigeria says if they're not up to standard, they should be fired more than 10 times because investors depend on performance to thrive. In the absence of it, getting the sack is inevitable, says Maklek. Belong Badji in the Gambia says, I don't have a problem with changing coaches even in the same year, as they are judged by results. And to avoid that, it's a must for them to provide a well-structured team which will be able to produce good results and to avoid blaming players for any losses. On the other hand, Usman Cisse says sometimes it's not the fault of the coach, but it is the players' fault. They can be underperforming. And Laurie Morse in England says it's not always the manager's fault. Players are paid way too much money, even for bad performances, so they should be paid by performance, says Laurie. Vicky Lockie went further into the Chelsea issue, saying, I think Chelsea should sell all of their players and start afresh. And on a somewhat humorous note, David Obonye says, I think there should be a manager's or coach's transfer window every 4 months. And finally, Sideko Suno in the Gambia got in touch saying, I think the teams in the Premier League should be ready to give more of a chance to coaches for them to be successful. For example, Chelsea fired Thomas Tuchel based on no tangible reasons. Sometimes the players are the main reason why some of these coaches lose their jobs because they simply don't like the playing style of the coach, says Sideko. Well, thanks so much to everybody who got in touch. Always great to hear from you here on Planet Sport Football Africa, a show brought to you by Passion for Sport. Let's go to the English Premier League now and to our European football expert Stuart Weir in the UK. So this weekend, Manchester City playing Leicester, Arsenal away to West Ham, Arsenal leading City by 6 points now. So Stuart, what's the implications of last week's draw for Arsenal with Liverpool?
Well, Steve, we said last week that Arsenal go to Liverpool with the games the weekend, and it certainly didn't disappoint. Arsenal going into that game with an 8-point lead and suddenly cut to 6, and remembering that City have a game in hand and that Arsenal have to go to City. It's very tight. Now, Arsenal began at Liverpool as if they really meant business. A goal up in 8 minutes, 2 up after half an hour, but then dramatically they lost control of the game to Liverpool. Mo Salah scored before half-time, and then Firmino equalised just before the end. But there was still time for Salah to bring a great save from Ramsdale right at the end. So actually, Liverpool could have won the game. And, horror of horrors, Mo Salah missed a penalty. And for the second time in succession, he put it wide. Against Bournemouth, remember, he shot high and wide. Against Arsenal, he went for the bottom corner and missed. So, yes, Arsenal are still top of the league and 6 points clear, but it looks an awful lot more open than it did last week. And, Steve, there was an extraordinary incident in that game when Andrew Robertson of Liverpool went to speak to one of the assistant referees, and the official appeared to strike Robertson with his elbow. We understand that the PGMOL, which controls referees, is investigating the incident and that the official concerned has been stood down. And with Tottenham, Manchester United and Newcastle all winning, the battle for the other 2 Champions League places is as tight as ever. Poor old Brighton lost 2-1 to Tottenham, but after the game, the Premier League admitted that Brighton should have had a penalty. And to make it worse, this is the 3rd time this season that the Premier League has had to admit to Brighton that the officials got it wrong, made a serious error, which is costing Brighton points. At the bottom of the table, wins for West Ham, Wolves and Bournemouth helped their cause, leaving Nottingham Forest, Leicester and Southampton in the relegation places. Wolves beat Chelsea 1-0, so no fairy tale return to Chelsea for Frank Lampard. Chelsea had only 1 shot on target in the whole game. I mean, how can you spend $600 million on players and only manage 1 shot on goal? Brentford lost 2-1 to Newcastle United with Ivan Toney scoring a penalty but missing another, bringing to an end his run of 24 successful penalties scored before that one. Watching live football in the Premier League is as popular as ever, with an average attendance of over 40,000 per game this season. Manchester United has the highest average and also the highest capacity stadium, 73,800 on average. West Ham, Tottenham and Arsenal, 3 London clubs, all averaging more than 60,000 a game, while Liverpool, Manchester City and Newcastle all average more than 50,000. I mentioned last week, Steve, that Forest had stated that they were sticking with manager Steve Cooper. And you will recall that in October, the owners said the same thing and fired the head of recruitment and the chief scout. Well, 6 months later, and Filippo Giraldi, the sporting director appointed to replace those 2 who were fired in October, well, he's gone. So again, the owner is blaming bad recruitment and not blaming the manager.
It's really interesting how Nottingham Forest have kept so much faith in the manager, Steve Cooper. Now then, what about the Uefa Champions League, Stuart? Manchester City against Bayern Munich. What a game that was.
Well, Steve, one of the things I love about the Champions League is the way it puts the best team in the Premier League against the best team from another top European country. So when Manchester City, reigning Premier League champions, and without question the club with the strongest squad in the Premier League, were drawn at home to Bayern Munich, the dominant German club, I just couldn't wait. And if you look at the statistics, possession, passes, opportunities, there was not a lot between the 2 clubs in the first leg at Manchester this week. But if you want a ruthless ability to turn possession into goals, it was a one-sided game. Manchester City simply took their chances and scored 3 goals. Never say never, but I can't see Manchester City conceding 4 goals in Germany in the second leg. And you know, Pep Guardiola is a manager who makes brave decisions. In my opinion, Riyad Mahrez has been outstanding for Manchester City this season, but he was left on the bench, an unused substitute against Bayern, with Grealish and Bernardo Silva prepared. And how can you blame or criticise Guardiola when he beats one of the best teams in Europe 3-0? Incidentally, Sadio Mane was also on the bench, only getting 22 minutes for Bayern. And that really was when the game was already lost. And afterwards, Mane was involved in a strange incident where allegedly he and Leroy Sané had an argument which resulted in Mane punching Sané and being banned from the next game. And it seemed to be about a situation where Mane felt he was in a better position and that Sané should have passed to him. Chelsea lost 2-0 to holders Real Madrid, playing the last half hour with 10 men after Ben Chilwell was sent off. Now, Real Madrid's top striker, Benzema, had a quiet game, not seeing much of the ball, but he was on hand to tap in when Kepa couldn't hold a long shot. But isn't that what great strikers do? They can be anonymous, but they're there when it matters. And incredibly, that was his 20th goal against English clubs in the Champions League. Inter Milan took a huge step towards the semi-finals with a 2-0 win over Benfica in Portugal. Romelu Lukaku scored and Andre Onana kept a clean sheet. And AC Milan kept the dream of a Milan semi-final alive by beating Napoli 1-0 in the first leg, with Ismail Bennacer from Algeria scoring the only goal. But I'm afraid that Napoli's Cameroonian Andre Frank Zambo Anguissa, he was shown a red card.
Yes, for a reckless challenge there by Anguissa, and Victor Osimhen, the Nigerian, missed that game for Napoli due to injury. And now going back to the Sadio Mane incident, asking on social media this week, what do you think about what happened there? As a Senegal star, Sadio Mane has been suspended for Bayern Munich's game this Saturday after allegedly punching teammate Leroy Sané after that loss to Man City. So what do you think about what happened with Mane being a role model to many in African football? Should he have been fired, suspended, fined or forgiven? What do you make of this incident? You can go to our Facebook page, Planet Sport Football Africa, and post a comment there, or send us a WhatsApp to +44 79 55 232 780. That's +44 79 55 232 780. What do you think about the Sadio Mane incident? And what else have you got for us, Stuart?
Well, Burnley, relegated last season, have been promoted straight away to the Premier League under the managership of Vincent Kompany. Anas Zarouri, a Belgian-born Moroccan, and Samuel Bastien from DR Congo are in their squad. But brilliant performance by Burnley, but of course they've got two challenges now. Can they survive in the Premier League next season? And can they hold on to Vincent Kompany, who looks a very attractive manager for teams looking for one? And I couldn't go through a week without talking about managers. And Leicester City have appointed Dean Smith as manager until the end of the season. Smith, you will recall, was fired by Aston Villa in 2022 after 3 seasons, then had a season and a bit at Norwich City, fired again, and Leicester, second from bottom, go to Manchester City on Saturday. That's a difficult place to start. Steve, I thought you need to know that the Chelmsford Chieftains were recently beaten in the final of ice hockey's Southern Division. The reason I'm mentioning that is that the Chieftains' goalminder is Peter Cech. When Cech pulled down the curtain on his football career, which included 4 Premier League titles, 5 FA Cups with Chelsea, not to mention 124 international caps for the Czech Republic, he went back to ice hockey, a game he had played as a teenager, but had to give up in favour of football. Cech is now 40, he trains twice a week, and observers say he's lost none of the old competitive spirit.
Amazing. So Peter Cech playing ice hockey. Thanks a lot, Stuart. That's it for the show for this week. So from me, Steve Vickers in Harare, and from Ida Waringa and from Stuart Weir, thanks a lot for listening. And Planet Sport Football Africa is a passion for sport production.